All right, cool. What is up, everyone? So today we're going to go to the perfect crime. Again, I'm skipping the transparency of evil for now because I don't have a physical copy of it, and I need to work with the physical copy, or at least an online version or an ebook version or PDF, but I don't have that because I suck. So for now, we're going to just go with the perfect crime, which I happen to have on hand. So this book is really important, and it's one that we can't skip. People can't gloss over if they want to really get into what Baudrillard is doing, because in this book he really untangles some of the more complex ideas that he's been working with up until this point. Notably, in this book, he makes the claim, very important claim, that simulation is not the opposite of reality. An idea that I know many people miss, where some people would be inclined to think that there's some kind of telos, okay, where there's some kind of progress that goes from reality to simulation, and this comes about with virtual technologies or with information or anything like that. Whereas Baudrillard wants to trouble that idea. Whereas simulation for Baudrillard is in many ways the hyperreal, or the more real than real, or the injection of reality into the world. So what does he mean by that? Well, hopefully this book will come to kind of explain that. So he begins the book in a way that challenges what I just said. He starts out by saying this. This is a story of a crime, of the murder of reality, and the extermination of an illusion, the vital illusion, the radical illusion of the world. The real does not disappear into illusion. It is illusion that disappears into integral reality. So in order to really get at this idea, I'm going to jump into the book a little bit to a rather important passage. So this is at the beginning of the chapter called The Radical Illusion, where he says that it is not then the real which is the opposite of simulation. The real is merely a particular case of that simulation, but illusion. So it is, for Baudrillard, illusion that is that which opposes simulation, not reality. Okay, so moreover, to jump a little bit later in the book, because you have to do this when working with Baudrillard, you kind of need to make your own narrative with it because it's so aphoristic. You know what I mean by that is that it's kind of all over the place, where no chapter is part of like a sequence. Rather, these are kind of different ideas that come together in a fragmented way, like kind of fractals of a whole. So what he says later on page 38 is that we are no longer alienated within a conflictual reality. We are expelled by a definitive, non-contradictory reality. So this moment is very important because it tells us that for Baudrillard, reality is not a singular thing. And we can, I think, syllogistically, so we can conclude then that because reality and simulation are part and parcel of the same system to some extent, then we can apply the same kind of logic, the same logic to simulation itself, where perhaps we can say that simulation is not a singular thing either. So we have reality, we have, as he defines it here, we have the conflictual reality, which is probably the better one, and then we have the non-contradictory reality, which is the oppressive one for Baudrillard. I will say, and perhaps someone could trouble this, that the same can be said of simulation, where we can have a conflictual, which would be a good form of simulation, and we can have a non-contradictory, which would be the bad form of simulation, or the oppressive form of simulation. So what that means, or I think what is important, the biggest idea we can take from that, is that Baudrillard's notion of simulation, Baudrillard's notion of reality, or of anything like that, does not have some kind of inextricable affinity with technology. Whereas this is part of another system, really the cultural project of trying to demystify the world through, to put it quite broadly and to perhaps give it more of a singular locus locus of temporality than it has, I will say that what Baudrillard is speaking against or speaking to is the Enlightenment project, that project that sought to essentially demystify the world. So when Baudrillard is writing about non-contradictory reality, that oppressive form of reality, I believe what he means is that he is really against the idea that there can be this thing called reality, or in other words, this thing called truth in materialism or in anything like that can point us to some kind of realness to the world. A notion that for him would simply be, he would simply ask, well, realness for whom? Who has established this realness? And then with his conversations about war, or theories about war, it would certainly be a project of the West to try and make the world realized. So if we extend this idea over to simulation, I think that we can formulate a pretty interesting theory that the oppressive form of simulation, because I'm extending it here from reality, because as he says, reality and simulation aren't opposites, the non-contradictory form of simulation, being the bad one, is that form that solidifies identity or crystallizes people in a simulated form from which they cannot escape. So it's non-contradictory in that there's no chance for mobility. They are essentially crushed under the weight of a sort of all-pervasive neo-colonial type gaze that reduces people to their simulated form. Okay, so all this to say, as a kind of preface, that this book is really important for Baudrillard. So starting from the first chapter here, just the perfect crime, Baudrillard almost undoes his entire project, or at least the project that's sort of put forth by the title alone, notably that there can be a thing called the perfect crime, or that the perfect crime can actually be conducted. Whereas for Baudrillard, but the fact is that the crime is never perfect, for the world betrays itself by appearances, which are the clues to its non-existence, the traces of the continuity of the nothing. So this is a notion that he builds upon very slightly in one of his following books, The Vital Illusion. I hope I didn't just lie. I'm pretty sure that one follows this one, where he considers the possibility that we can never actually fully eradicate things like the duel or the challenge or seduction, and that the world will always maintain them in some capacity. So when he says this, when he speaks about the way in which appearances might retain their meaning to some extent, or because we are always working at the level of images, Baudrillard is revealing the fact that we are always in kind of the first order simulacrum to some extent, that kind of non-oppressive form of simulation that allows people, through their being images, through their only ever coming into fruition through their appearance, it allows them to get away from any sort of, let's say, for instance, biological determinacy, or any kind of discourse that seeks to ground people and to suggest that there's no movement away from that. Whereas images allow for a sort of mobility. Now, this is an idea that he puts forth in Seduction when he talks about, astrology. And he says, he pretty much says that astrology is very important, because astrology shows us that the world is an enigmatic place, and there are things that can happen based on these based on these kind of what would be a good word, not weird, based off of these kind of superficial or superstitious hypotheses from the stars. Baudrillard says, why can't that be just as real as some kind of scientific hypotheses or scientific approaches that adopt the scientific method? Whereas for Baudrillard, any of these ideas they're surely as valid, and we should take them as such. But with that being said, that does not mean that there is a giant enterprise of disillusionment, that's one of his quotes, that is trying very hard to eradicate the possibility of the world being aware of its mobility, the world being aware of the fact that it does only manifest itself in the form of appearances, and that there isn't, underneath all the appearances, some kind of ontological certainty of the human, of the earth, or of anything like that. Rather, everything is determined to some extent by, I guess people are just malleable in that way. They are determined by a sort of setting in which they find themselves. Not to be totally, relativistic about it, but I think that would be, in a sense, the best way to kind of explain it here. So of this, he says, we can bear neither the void, nor the secret, nor pure appearance. And why should we decipher it, instead of letting its illusion shine out as such in all its glory? Well, the fact that we cannot bear its enigmatic character is also an enigma, also part of the enigma. It is part of the world that we cannot bear either the illusion of the world or pure appearance. We would be no better at coping with radical truth and transparency if these existed. So in all this, opposed to those three terms he just gave us, opposed to the secret, the pure appearance, or the void, we erect this notion of reality, the oppressive form, mind you. And it really, when I speak about it as such, like I'm not writing an essay right now, so I don't have to really give this preamble, but I will. When I speak about reality, unless I say otherwise, I'm going to be speaking about it in the oppressive form, so the non-contradictory form. So in this world, for Baudrillard, reality is simply the dregs of the sacred illusion offered up to the jackals of science. So really, it is a sort of residual notion of a time long gone, or perhaps not all that gone, in the form of illusion that reality has borrowed from. Reality has some trace elements of this old form, but is ultimately taken up to some extent by these jackals of science. So technology, the thing that is often located alongside Baudrillard's notion of simulation, is for Baudrillard, it occupies this sort of ambivalent space where he's ambivalent about it, but it occupies an ambiguous space where he says that perhaps through technology, the world is toying with us. The object is seducing us by giving us the illusion of power over it. A dizzying hypothesis, rationality culminating in technical virtuality, might be the last of the ruses of unreason. Of that will to illusion of which, as Nietzsche says, the will to truth is merely a derivative and an avatar. So this resonates well with Arthur C. Clarke's idea that, as technology reaches a certain point, it'll be indistinguishable from magic. Was that Clarke? Wait, I better check. Yeah, it was Clarke. Yeah, sorry. It'll be indistinguishable from magic, which I think Baudrillard is really speaking to here, where he doesn't want to be that kind of person that just simply disavows kind of technological developments, nor does he celebrate it, right? So he is ambivalent about it, because on the one hand, technology is part of that sort of system of reality that is oppressive, that attempt to kind of dispel the world, demystify the world, kind of eradicate the possibility of illusion to come through. But at the same time, Baudrillard is suggesting that perhaps in technology there is simply a new rule, a new game with new rules that we must, I guess, abide by, where it's not simply comprised of laws, as certain theorists might say, where technology is a sort of perfect operationality under the auspices of certain laws. But for Baudrillard, perhaps there's something to be said about the rule within technology, where it is simply a new game. So this idea really resonates well with his notion of reversibility. So reversibility, and which takes the form of seduction around the late 70s in Baudrillard's work. Reversibility is the notion that no system is perfect in and of itself, rather, or the noumena. I'm going to butcher up Kant a little bit, but let's put that aside. No system is perfect in and of itself. Rather, every system is susceptible to its own reversion, to its own allowing into itself the kind of mirror of the thing it opposes, or the thing it opposes itself, and effectively mirroring that thing. So in that way, when Baudrillard speaks about the possibility of reconciling these old notions of illusion in technology, I think what he's getting at is that no system can be so perfect as to totally eradicate illusion or seduction or anything like that. Because, as he says, if everything had been perfect, the world would quite simply not exist, and if, by some misfortune, it were to become so again, it would quite simply not exist anymore. Who's to say if that's even possible? But, he gives us this thesis or this hypothesis. So in all this, and he says he has this rather interesting part when he says that existence is something we must not consent to. It has been given to us as a consolation prize, and we must not believe in it. Rather, for him, and I'm jumping a little bit here, for him the only thing we should consent to is the rule. But in that case, we are speaking not of the rule of the subject, but of the way of the world. In brackets, jeu du monde, or the game of the world would be a literal translation. So in that case, I think we can insert here, instead of rule of the way of the world, we can insert the word object. So the sentence would read as follows: But in that case, we are speaking not of the rule of the subject, but of the rule of the object. Where this is one of its central theses, running throughout most of his works, from about fatal strategies, where he really lays this out, where he suggests that the object is that thing that wrests us out of the determinacy of subjectivity, that gives us a sort of possibility of, in kind of the Deleuzean, Guattarian fashion, of becoming. But for Baudrillard, this isn't something that can be really mobilized or harnessed, as it is in Deleuze and Guattari, which it's not as though it totally is in them either. But I'm thinking of that moment in 1,000 Plateaus when they write that they call upon the reader to dare deterritorialize yourself, remove your face, kind of thing, become a body without organs. Whereas Baudrillard would never say that, because he doesn't see that possibility of necessarily harnessing that power, harnessing that potential. Rather, this is just something that can possibly happen to you. And I guess if there was a strategy to be leveled, it would be one of the object. So it would be about maintaining the existence of the object that would allow for us to constantly question and constantly challenge our notion of subjectivity. But this shouldn't be understood in dialectical terms either, where the subject and object are not two things that come together in a moment of synthesis. That could never happen for Baudrillard. Rather, it is their radical alterity from one another that gives them the possibility to exist. And Baudrillard speaks about this in one of his many interviews, and I can't remember who it was with, because that was I can probably find it, but it was one of his interviews, where he says that what is important when we consider binaries, we consider distinctions like the subject and the object, is that they are necessary, because each one of them is the means by which the other can not only come into being, but the other can come to change. Where when we deal with two things, like one of the binaries that he speaks about often, or well, not so often, but sometimes, the masculine and the feminine, for Baudrillard, it's not as though each of these things occupies some kind of determinate field. Rather, it is their being opposed to one another that allows them to enter a sort of duel, a kind of mutual challenge, where they are forced out of their respective positions continually and kind of diverted into different paths, which would be the Latin notion of reversibility, reversus, that is to divert from one's path, or seduction, I should say. Séduire would be that, to divert from one's path, and that'd be French. So in that way, so this is an aside. I'm kind of going off on a tangent here, but thinking about how Baudrillard considers distinctions or considers binaries is important, and it can be problematic at times, but it is pretty integral to grasping his work, because he's really opposing the notion of the dialectic, which runs throughout all of his work, really. Sorry for all the background noise. I'm on the road, and I happen to be in a place where their furnace is rather loud, and I'm trying to soundproof this room as best I can. So to kind of get back on track here, he makes clear that illusion is indestructible, literally in his words, and this is page 19. At all events, illusion is indestructible. Yet, he says, just above that it is said that the state of nature is unthinkable, because in that state, thought does not exist. But this is exactly what we are moving towards, a state of pure operational intelligence, and thus of a radical disillusioning of thought. So on one hand, we have the idea that illusion is indestructible. On the other hand, we have this process of disillusionment. So which is it, Baudrillard? And honestly, the answer is tricky, right? Because, we can go on a leap of faith and say that, oh, well, this is just kind of a separate system that is actually capable of getting rid of illusion. But then we could be so, we'd have to be a little hard on ourselves for putting forth that idea, precisely because there are a number of places where Baudrillard says, no, it can't actually go away. But what I want to focus on here, and what I think is interesting, is that Baudrillard kind of locates a primal state of existence. So in the state of nature, he says, where thought does not exist. So he equates the state of nature with the state of pure operational intelligence. So this is through like these virtual technologies or whatever that, think for us and calculate for us and all that type of stuff. And it's really interesting how Baudrillard equates the two, where it's almost as though we're regressing, right? So this is Baudrillard's really, pessimistic Platonism kind of coming through a little bit here, and it's difficult to kind of to work with. But what I would suggest, to put forward some kind of an idea, is that as we approach a certain point through all this technical total operationality, what we can see happen or hypothesize might happen is the realization of a moment in which we no longer have to think. So that we could take that a number of ways. We could say that would mean that we are just, we're stupid, kind of the rhetoric that goes around today, obviously. But it might also mean that we've attained a degree of singularity. So singularity is one of his ideas that he only really builds on later. I don't think, we might get at it a little bit in this book. I don't remember yet fully if we get into it here, but it's certainly an idea he built on later, where singularity implies that any system, any grouping, anything really, is perfect in and of itself. So when we have a singularity, we have a let's take like a community. We have a community that is so perfect it need not consider alternatives. So this would appear to be, just mentioning this, this would be indicative of non-contradictory reality or non-contradictory simulation, that form that Baudrillard dislikes because it doesn't allow for change. So in that way, we open up another distinction. So there is not only oppressive solidification, oppressive kind of crystallization in the form of, one's inability to change or develop, but then we also have the kind of emancipatory form of it, where people are satisfied within their kind of own cultural identity. And what is important, I think, for Baudrillard, and it's almost as though we can apply a specific number to it, where if it's on a small scale, like a town or or any kind of, or like a village or anything like that, this kind of moment can be attained. What Baudrillard really fears is that this occurs on a global scale, where everyone adopts kind of the same ideas in the form of globalization, which is to be distinguished from universalization, which he distinguishes in, I believe it's the agony of power, but we'll get to that. So we can make a distinction then between oppressive forms of singularity, or to keep within the lexical framework of this book, or as he just presented it, we can arrive or exist in a non-oppressive form of non-thought, but we can also be in an oppressive form of non-thought. just as we can be in an oppressive form of reality, we can also be in a non-oppressive form of reality. Just as we can be within simulation, we can be, or an oppressive form of simulation, we can be within a non-oppressive form of simulation. I've never actually put that in words, so that was good, but that's an idea that I'm sure many people will have problems with, and it's a really difficult one. Like, one day I'll upgrade to having a video camera and I'll be able to draw this stuff out, because it is very visual, and it'd be a lot easier if I could draw down the binaries. But yeah, so in that way, people use certain terms from Baudrillard's work, like simulation, hyperreality, reality, illusion, but people don't use illusion all that much, at least as far as I know. Excuse me, Jesus. I don't know what's going on with my voice. They use these terms without considering that in Baudrillard, they all occupy more than one identity. It's not as though any of these things can come to describe any given thing on its own, right? They're enmeshed with a number of different meanings, which is, I don't know if Baudrillard really did this deliberately, but it's really genius in relation to his broader project of resisting these kind of ontological certainties, where none of his terms have a set definition, where none of his terms can really be grasped. Which is, I think, one of the most interesting things about him, really. So to return to this idea of a sort of oppressive form of reality, he says that the perfect crime is that of an unconditional realization of the world by the actualization of all data, the transformation of all our acts and all events into pure information, in short, the final solution. The resolution of the world ahead of time by the cloning of reality and the extermination of the real by its double. So, in order to accentuate this point, he alludes to Arthur C. Clarke's story, The 9 Billion Names of God, where there's a community of Tibetan monks that are slowly and methodically providing all the different names of God. And one day, a technician from IBM shows up and says, "Hey, I could do this for you in like 2 days if you let me plug in my computer and generate all the different possible permutations of God." So the IBM person goes ahead and does it, and they come to find that after all the names of God have been effectively stated or brought into the world, then the stars start to go out, signaling kind of the end of the world, as though as soon as all things, or as soon as all the names of God are made real or made apparent, then the world ceases to exist. And Baudrillard uses this story to kind of hypothesize the possibility that if all things are made totally real, then the world itself will cease to exist. However, it would be wrong to assume that, these kind of virtual technologies indicative of the technician worker of IBM or any other technology per se, is in opposition to some kind of real reality or some kind of realness. Now, this is the discourse, you can get this all over the internet. People saying like, you have to get away from your phone and get in touch with nature and all that kind of crap, as though, nature has some kind of connection to a so-called realness. Whereas, as we know, nature only exists as such when it has been rendered subordinate to the metropolis, to the cosmopolitan scene. So in that way, someone going to nature isn't actually getting out of the system, but they're participating in that very system that bifurcates nature from urban or whatever. So of this, Baudrillard makes a really interesting point. He says that the critique of virtual technologies masks the fact that their concept is seeping everywhere into real life in homeopathic doses. In denouncing the ghostliness of those technologies and of the media, one implies that there is somewhere an original form of lived experience. So in this way, that sort of discourse of getting into nature or reality or whatever participates in another oppressive framework, notably the one that accentuates the idea or suggests that there is a thing called reality that is tangible, that can be found, and that can be essentially harnessed, Whereas for Baudrillard, all that does is participate in this hyperreal system where reality is made more real than real. It's given a face. People can say, oh, it's over there in the trees. That's where reality is, which is, it bores me to death. And this is my critique of, certain media like Black Mirror or other things like that, like a fantastic television show, no doubt about it. But people often get caught in a trap when they engage with those media, because they believe that there is something called reality out there, and that with our technologies we are actually moving away from it. And I think that this can be we can look at this in the same ways we've been looking at other key terms in Baudrillard's work, notably how they can all kind of correspond to a different definition or different reality, where there can be an oppressive and an unoppressive form of nature for Baudrillard, where there can be that thing called nature that predates, human consciousness, that predates a sort of giant project of disillusionment. And then there's the oppressive form, where nature is given a face, where nature is kind of consolidated. It's configured within the kind of cultural zeitgeist or the cultural imaginary in the form of an emancipatory space, in the form of a productive zone that can be harnessed, right? And this is, one of the things that some Marxists get wrong for Baudrillard, is that we cannot harness a kind of deep down libidinal desire within humans to oppose a system, because that act signals more productivity than the system itself. It's rendering the body, it's rendering the mysteries of the body productive, giving them a face, giving them an identity, giving them a punch in, punch out card, and making them work for you to some extent. And we do the same for nature in that way. But then we're presented with other ideas throughout this book as we work through it that make it difficult to reconcile, a single idea. And this only emphasizes my point, or elucidates my point, that whenever we're speaking of any of these terms, Baudrillard means both it and its opposite to some extent, where he says this: McLuhan saw modern technologies as the extension of man. We should see them rather as the expulsion of man, as though in Baudrillard's mind there was this thing called man. I reluctantly use that term, or there was once this thing called the human that preceded these technologies. So it's as though Baudrillard is participating in that same kind of oppressive rhetoric that, he would accuse those people, as I just mentioned, critiquing virtual technologies of committing. But, and I think this is our only way to get around it, we have to assume that Baudrillard is referring to the oppressive form of these kind of modern technologies. So it's a blanket term, what are modern technologies? Are modern technologies like glasses people wear, or hearing aids? Are they, video game consoles or calculators? Who knows what Baudrillard necessarily refers to or what he means when he talks about this. So we're kind of left to assume. But what we can kind of ascertain from this suggestion is that he's referring to the oppressive form of that system, the oppressive form of modern technologies that are seeking to purge the world of its illusion. So if we focus on one particular instance of virtual technologies, we could think of artificial intelligence, where for Baudrillard, artificial intelligence is that zone or that kind of creation of a double of ourselves. Sorry again, my voice, I have no idea what's going on. So of this he says not only of artificial intelligence, but of all the advanced technological process points up to the fact that behind his doubles and his prostheses, his biological clones and his virtual images, man takes advantage of these things to disappear. So it is with the answer phone, we aren't here, leave a message, and the video plugged into the TV takes over the job of watching the film for you. Had there not been that possibility, you would have felt obliged to watch it, since you always feel a little responsible for the films you haven't seen, the desires you haven't fulfilled, the people you haven't replied to, the crimes you haven't committed, the money you haven't spent. So we are all trapped then in a sort of, in a desire to, create doubles of ourselves that can go ahead and do the things that, this world demands of us, the kind of unreal demands of modern society that, we use our doubles to work on, our doubles to, I guess, keep us going. One example of this could be Instagram, where one of our duties in this present world is to convince everyone that everything is okay. So we do this by, erecting images of ourselves, being happy, being great, being whatever, effectively to keep the system going to some capacity or to serve that function of the system. But in all of this, however, we always make mistakes. And Baudrillard is clear that, and this is echoing his earlier statements that ultimately the illusion of the world is indestructible. He says that the perfect crime would have been to invent a faultless world and withdraw from it without leaving a trace. But we cannot achieve this. We leave traces everywhere: viruses, lapses, germs, and catastrophes, signs of imperfection which are, so to speak, man's signature on the heart of the artificial world. So if these are elements of a sort of reality, what we can claim to be part of a real kind of humanness, that is contradiction, or those kind of negative elements of our lives, viruses and catastrophes certainly aren't good things. Perhaps these are the things in the future that people are going to dig up, right? Or whoever is going to dig up and have as artifacts of our reality, where perhaps there will one day be, in Baudrillard's words, fossilized vestiges of the real, as there are of past geological ages, a clandestine cult of real objects venerated as fetishes, which will take on mythic value. Already old objects seem like real ones by contrast with objects from the industrial age, but this is merely a prefiguring of the days when the tiniest tangible object will be as precious as an Egyptian relic. So perhaps some of those objects that point to a sort of reality as though we were humans will be, the remnants of cities, kind of rendered unhospitable due to nuclear fallout or something like that point to the fact that there was still a thing called conflict, right? Where non-contradictory reality hadn't seeped in totally, where there was still the remnants of that notion of conflictual reality. So all these oppressive mechanisms then correspond to that notion of hyperreal, right? Of the hyperreal, or of the form of oppressive reality. But Baudrillard makes a distinction then, a critical temporal one, where he says that reality exists then only within a certain time frame and a certain level of acceleration within a certain window of expanding systems, within a phase of liberation, a phase in which our modern societies have found themselves until now, but which they are currently leaving behind, with reality being lost once again, as the same expanding systems undergo further anamorphosis, in illusion, though this time in virtual illusion. So Baudrillard really brings this point up in Symbolic Exchange and Death when he lays out the three orders of simulation, where he says that reality really belongs to the second order. Reality is really that moment where we saw things like dialectics, where we saw things like the psyche with psychoanalysis, where we saw things like history, where all that is coming to an end. So reality exists in a temporal sense, it's very limited. So then he brings up an interesting moment out of a Marx Brothers film. I actually don't know which one. He just says one of their films. But the Marx Brothers, for those that don't know, were I think there are three of them, three brothers that were actors and kind of movie makers back in the day. And I guess I have the internet here. All right, sorry, there were four of them: Chico, Harpo, Groucho, and Zeppo, and they starred in a number of films. I've only seen one of them, the one titled Duck Soup, and one of their tropes is that they really make a mockery of the thing called reality. They really call into question all of our systems of thought, all of our systems of understanding, and kind of turn them on their head. So there's this one moment I can think of where this was in Duck Soup. I think it was in Duck Soup. I may have seen another one, but whatever. There's this one moment when I think it was Groucho, but one of the Marx Brothers is sneaking through a house while someone else is following him, or vice versa. And they think they're looking at a mirror, but it's really the other person mirroring all their actions at the exact same moment. And this is like a really long scene. It must have taken forever to film because their movements are almost identical until finally it's made apparent that, he wasn't actually looking at a mirror, but there was someone else there. And it's super interesting, and it's very Baudrillardian in the sense that reality is called into question, or the truthfulness of it. But of the Marx Brothers, sorry, I digress. Of the Marx Brothers, Baudrillard says that in one of their films, Harpo is leaning against a wall. "What are you doing here?" someone asks. "I'm holding up the wall." "Are you kidding? Get away." Harpo then steps aside, and the wall collapses. "Are we not all leaning?" Baudrillard asks us now. "Are we not all leaning against that wall? And is not that wall of reality? Or is that not the wall of reality? If just one person moved away, the wall would come down, burying the millions of people squatting this disused barracks. The situation is certainly one of a devastated reality, and there are already innumerable victims buried alive in the rubble. The point is not then to assert that the real does or does not exist, a ludicrous proposition, which well expresses that what that reality means to us, a tautological illusion, or a tautological hallucination. There is merely a movement of the exacerbation of reality towards paroxysm." So paroxysm is an endpoint to its logical conclusion, where it involutes of its own accord and implodes, leaving no trace, not even the sign of its end, for the body of the real was never recovered. In the shroud of the virtual, the corpse of the real is forever unfindable. So Baudrillard makes apparent that there is kind of a collective agreement to engage in this notion called reality, where we all engage with it in some capacity, as he makes clear in our daily lives. This isn't something that necessarily just happens on the internet or anything in the media or whatever. We are all constantly participating in it because it does not simply demand that we actually are in the presence of technologies or electronics or virtuality, but that we are within the very system that, I guess, promotes the erasure of reality, or erasure of the non-oppressive form of reality. So this threat is ultimately, for Baudrillard, a kind of ending of night, right? As he says that the info-technological threat is the threat of an eradication of the night, of that precious difference between night and day by a total illumination of all moments. So it sounds like he's just talking about Kant here, and Kant's distinction between the beautiful and the sublime, where the beautiful corresponds to the day, right? To the seeing things as they are, and the sublime is the night, where things are obscured, where things are rendered, up to perception to some extent. So it's almost giving away, or this system is giving away the power of the sublime as it is connected to the nighttime in favor of the beautiful, in favor of the obscene, to be properly Baudrillardian, the more beautiful than beautiful. So funnily enough, it's only at this point, really later on in the book, around on page 62, my verso version, where Baudrillard gives us a definition of illusion. So of it, he says that illusion is the quality of a world which, by the antinomic structure of matter, retains the potentiality of the nullification and immaterial return to energy. Illusion is the characteristic of what retains the possibility of wiping itself out by a violent reversion, matter, antimatter, abreaction, and, therefore, of passing beyond material objectivity. Matter and antimatter are indistinguishable in the absolute. They shine with the same light, they are distinct, linked to each other only by virtue of the possibility of cancelling each other out. Only energy bound to restricted materiality, to our materiality, is doomed to dissipation and entropy. So this is particularly important in my mind, because how I understand illusion, at least how he lays it out here, is similar to how I've been describing it over all these episodes or all these things I do, where he says, where I believe that illusion is that very possibility of having things change, or in his terms here, illusion is that which retains the possibility of wiping itself out, allowing even illusion to fall to to be victim to a sort of reversion or to a sort of disappearance. And this is something, I'd love to write a book on this, maybe I will one day, that I think that Baudrillard's real project is, not as some people take it to be, where they consider Baudrillard a thinker of simulation or hyperreality or seduction or anything like that. I think that Baudrillard is really a thinker of disappearance and what it means when things come to disappear, notably conflict or contradiction. And this idea really resonates well with another talk I did on another book by Colasso, The Ruin of Cash, where Colasso says that sacrifice for Colasso is that institution that allows things to kind of be maintained to some extent in a sort of symbolic fashion. Colasso says that even sacrifice must be sacrificed, where we'll see the end of it. And it's a very difficult idea to kind of wrap, to accept. But I think that Baudrillard is saying the same thing here, where the radicality of illusion is in its propensity to not take itself even too seriously, to not fall prey to that objectivity model, or the model of objectivity that pervades in the realm of reality. So in opposition to illusion in this way, reality is that thing that doesn't seem to want to disappear. In fact, reality is always seeming to be more than itself, where we enter the phase of the hyperreal, right? Where it's hyperreality taken to the nth power, where we have there's no conception of the notion of hyper-illusion, at least I don't think anywhere in Baudrillard's work, but we have this thing called hyperreal, or hyperreality, of which he says that we labor under the illusion that it is the real we lack the most, but actually reality is at its highest. By our technical exploits, we've reached such a degree of reality and objectivity that we might even speak of an excessive reality, i.e. just, hyperreality. So this is only made more apparent when Baudrillard says that what we lack most is a conceptualization of the completion of reality, which I think would mark its end. There is no end in sight for reality, just as there is the possibility of an end for illusion. Precisely because we saw it to some extent get overturned by reality. And this sort of oppressive reality is in the service or in the business of dispelling or exercising negativity from the world. Sorry, I messed up a bunch of those. So the dialectic has indeed fulfilled itself. But ironically, one might say not at all, by taking in the negative, as in the dream of critical thought, but in a total, irrevocable positivity, by absorption of the negative, or quite simply by the fact that the negative denying itself has merely generated a redoubled positivity. Thus the negative disappears in substance, and, if the dialectic has run its course, it has done so in the parodic, parody, mode of its elimination, by the ethnic cleansing of the concept. So we are still forced to think this pure positivity, to think the depassed real, and no longer the peaceful surpassing of the real, or its doubling in the imaginary. And in this form of reality, Baudrillard says that the extermination of the negative is therefore the final solution, but the die is not cast. The destiny of the positive of a system culminating in positivity and pure speculation remains itself enigmatic, right? So he's only emphasizing the idea that the illusion cannot fully be purged, cannot fully be exercised. So it's very repetitive in that way, and I'm sorry, I'm trying, if you read this stuff, it's incredibly repetitive, each of the books on its own, even though they're gleaming little insights everywhere and little brilliant moments, there are many repetitive arguments, and I'm trying to kind of sift through it, and I'm giving you the Spark Notes coherent version as best I can, even though it's sometimes rather difficult. So we see then that through this whole system, we see it kind of being rendered object of the subject, which would again be, we have to think of this in a sort of oppressive way, where because Baudrillard wants to think of the object as being the messianic savior of the subject, or of the determinacy of subjectivity, where now what we are seeing with all these virtual technologies or this hyper reality or whatever term you want to throw in there, what we are seeing is the impossibility of a realization of subjectivity, right? But we still labor under the illusion that we have such a thing. So what he says is that the critical function of the subject has given way to the ironic function of the object. Once they have passed through the medium or through the image, through the spectrum of the sign and the commodity, objects, by their very existence, perform an artificial and ironic function. So we aren't thinking of this in terms of objects and subjects as perhaps they have historically existed, and the relationship between the two can hardly be conceived of as being the same. Instead, they each serve a sort of ironic function. So the term that he uses for that is pataphysical. Pataphysical is the science of imaginary solutions. It's kind of the it's the parody of science, really. And both the subject and the opposite object correspond to that in that they are made a sort of mockery of themselves, where the subject is that thing that is denied its subjectivity in the form of a total, apathetic indifference, free-floating non-control over its being, totally left to the whims of hyperreality. And the object is that thing that's given a sort of determinacy. Artificial intelligence, the internet, technology is given that agency that is being denied from subjects. So we see a reversal here, but it's an oppressive reversal, where the idea of having the subject and the object reverse into one another and fold into one another is in itself not a bad thing. But when it occurs in this system that we have crafted for ourselves, then it becomes bad. Just as simulation is not a bad thing in and of itself, only when it is paired with all of these other oppressive instantiations, manifestations, does it become oppressive or bad. So I'm going to end this episode here by reading out the last paragraph from this chapter, The Irony of Technology, about midway through the book. And then I'll take up the rest in the next one, where he says that we are faced ultimately with two irreconcilable hypotheses: that of the extermination of all the world's illusions by technology and the virtual, or that of an ironic destiny of all science and all knowledge in which the world and the illusion of the world would survive. The hypothesis of a transcendental irony of technology being by definition unverifiable, we have to hold to these two irreconcilable and simultaneously true perspectives. There is nothing which allows us to decide between them. As Wittgenstein says, the world is everything which is the case. And the only thing that I can really say to that is that I believe it's Baudrillard just essentially accentuating the fact that, this notion of illusion cannot be fully removed. I sound like a broken record, I'm sure. But when he says that, quoting Wittgenstein, that anything is simply, or everything is what it is, or how does it go? The world is everything which is the case, implies that any given system is still part of that world, and it is still part of that very illusion of the world, because that is what gives the world its meaning or its being. Notably, the illusion is that which, pushes things into existence. So on that note, I'll chime out here, but, I'd be super curious to see what other people have to think, especially if they have any problems with what I said, because this stuff it's difficult. And, I'm in my own academic career starting to move past this Baudrillard a little bit, because it's difficult to defend him, especially if you have really analytic thinkers that don't buy any of this many definitions crap or many possibilities for any of his terms. Which isn't to say that I'm that I'm going to leave Baudrillard totally, but it's difficult. It's difficult to grasp, and I'd be really curious to see what other people have to think about it or have to say about it. But on that note, for any of you that listen this far,